Good day. I am Professor Gustav Muller. In this video, we are going to focus on the relocation of a defined right-of-way as a result of a changed condition. However, before we proceed, let's just look at two preliminary notes. The first is the principles that enable us to relocate a defined right-of-way was laid down in Linvestment versus Hammersley by the Supreme Court of Appeal. The second important point is the definition of a changed condition. That definition is where the physical features of the land or the elements that pertain to the servitude are changed so that it fundamentally affects the functioning of the servitude. These include erosion of the land subject to the servitude as a result of floods or heavy rains. Secondly, where the servient or dominant tenements are changed to a different state than when the servitude was created as a result of droughts or other changes that occur slowly and incrementally over time. Or thirdly, where the effective use of the servitude is affected by changes in society, the economy, technology, or the political sphere. With those preliminary notes out of the way, let's delve into our scenario. But first, let's get a good lay of the land. On the west side of the property, we have a highway running slightly diagonally from south to north. We have mountains towards the north, the east, and the south. We have existing farms, Farm A, Farm B, and Farm C. On Farm A, the owner hosts cattle, farms with cattle. On Farm B, the owner runs a large agrarian facility, and on Farm C, the owner runs a game farm. We have an existing road that leads to a farm compound over here, and a way of necessity was established from this existing road across the property of Property B to the boundary of Property C. So what is the changed circumstance that I would like us to focus on this morning? Earlier in this video, I mentioned that this owner farms with agricultural products. She recently discovered a new technology that she would like to use on her farm. This new technology enables her to increase the size, the mass, as well as the quality of her crops. However, to exploit this new technology, she would have to relocate her crops that she established over here on her property to a different place. And that place is in the microclimate that operates in a 2-kilometer distance from the foot of this mountain over here. Now, I'm sure you can see that if the crops are relocated to where this existing way of necessity is, that will prove to be problematic. Now, in a previous video, we established this way of necessity. And we're going to draw on a lot of these principles to relocate them in future. So let's look at the requirements that the Supreme Court of Appeal laid down for us for the establishment or the relocation of this defined right-of-way. Okay, so the first requirement is that the servient tenement over here is or will be materially inconvenienced if the status quo is maintained. So let's just reflect on that for a moment. What does it mean if the status quo is maintained? The status quo, or the current position, is that the crops are over here and that the right of way operates over there, the way of necessity. What she would like to do is to relocate her crops from here upwards within a 2-kilometer distance from the foot of the mountain. And the reason she wants to do that is to exploit her farm using a new technology to yield better products. Now, she will be materially inconvenienced if she's unable to do so, and she will be unable to do so if that road cannot move. The second requirement is that the relocation must occur on the servient tenement. Now, let's just calibrate first and see which of these three properties are dominant and which are servient tenements. Let's start with property C. Property C is a dominant tenement. Why? Because it needs access to the highway in the west. So therefore, it is the dominant tenement. But this means that property B is the servient tenement to property C's dominant tenement, and property A is also a servient tenement. We have to remember, though, that property B may also be a dominant tenement in that it needs access to the highway over here, and therefore it is a dominant tenement towards property A, but at the same time is a servient tenement to property C. So, if the requirement is that the relocation must happen on the servient tenement, we can see that the relocation must occur here, because if something changes on this property, it is only this property that stands to be affected by the relocation. And since this is the dominant property, and this is the servient tenement, the relocation will have to happen here. The third requirement is that the dominant tenement must not be unduly prejudiced by the relocation. Now, for us to figure out whether the dominant tenement will be unduly prejudiced, we must first figure out where this existing defined right-of-way will relocate to. Now, I mentioned at the top of the video that we created another video where we established this way of necessity over here. Now, not all of those requirements are relevant here today. We will focus only on one, and that one is the route of the way. The guiding principle for us is the shortest route with the least damage, or in the original Dutch, the ter naaste lage and minster skade. Now, you will recall from that video that the shortest distance between 2 points is merely a straight line. So, I mentioned that I like to create a coping mechanism just by drawing a straight line for myself and see whether we can deviate from that line. All right. So if the crops are relocated upwards, north, to a 2-kilometer distance from the foothills of this mountain, it only makes sense for us as a starting point to relocate this defined right-of-way using our coping mechanism in a southerly direction. Something like this. I propose that we simply relocate the route somewhere like this. However, remember, the owner needs to still get to the original connection point over there. So we will also have to create a route that goes back to the original route over there. Now, previously we said that we can deviate from this coping mechanism in two circumstances. The first is that if the terrain is too rugged so that it doesn't create a practical alternative. Now the facts here merely indicate that these are crops that are going to be moved in any event. So the terrain, we can assume, is not too rugged. The second circumstance through which we can deviate from this route is if it causes undue prejudice. Now, since this owner is the one that seeks the relocation, she will have to bear with the relocation of the route and cannot complain about any inconvenience or prejudice that may arise. Similarly to our previous video, you will see that even when the route is relocated, the map or the diagram is to scale, and we have to remember that even small distances on this diagram is in fact quite large or quite vast in reality. However, in another Supreme Court of Appeal judgment, for purposes of relocation of defined rights-of-way, the Supreme Court of Appeal in the JJPC judgment added a third consideration. And that consideration is, we may not be able to relocate this route if this owner, the dominant tenement, suffers undue prejudice. And that will typically arise if the relocation of the route is along a very longer route. Now we can see that this is not the case here because the distance between these two horizontal lines, these two vertical lines are exactly the same. The line simply moved downwards. The owner would in any event have to drive up to this starting point over here, and that is the same over here. So therefore, we can conclude that this is not a longer route at all. This brings us to the final requirement, according to Linvestment versus Hammersley, for the relocation of a defined right-of-way. And that requirement is that the servient tenement must pay all the attendant costs for the relocation of this defined right-of-way. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Appeal is not clear to us what exactly those costs would include. However, I would argue that a good starting point would be for this owner, the owner of property B, to offer to property owner C the same costs that the Supreme Court of Appeal affirmed in Linvestment. These costs include the cost for surveying the land, the cost, secondly, for obtaining permissions from the local authority to effect the relocation. Third, and perhaps most important, the cost associated with constructing this road. And lastly, the cost for registering this new servitude in the deeds registry. Now, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court of Appeal did not provide us with much guidance in the judgment itself. It only made an order confirming these costs as attendant costs. We are lucky, fortunately, that during 2020, the commissioners for uniform state law in the United States promulgated an act, which it called the Uniform Easement Relocation Act. Now, in the United States of America, a servitude is referred to as an easement. Now, in the Uniform Easement Relocation Act, Section 7 of that Act, the commissioners provide us with exhaustive guidelines on what these attendant costs to relocate the defined right-of-way could include. And for purposes of the development of our law, that could be useful or fruitful ground for comparative research and further development in this field of the law. All right, so this brings us to the end of this video. You now know how to relocate a defined right-of-way due to changed conditions. I trust that you found this video useful and I hope to see you next time. In the interim, remember, little by little, a little becomes a lot.